I'll let you introduce yourself, Jackson, and get to it.
Sure, thank you, Mark. There is a slide for that, so I'll go ahead and figure out how to share my screen here. And let's see, let me click through some of these options. Can you guys see my screen and presentation okay?
We can. Thank you very much.
Awesome. I'll go and hop in. So my name is Jackson Wells, and I'll be covering building an autonomous BAS program. So first things first, I wanted to give a big thank you to SCYTHE, not only for having me talk here about what I love and my passion, but just getting all these security experts together to talk about security in the digital landscape. A quick agenda that I'm going to be covering is first off the typical who am I, just so you know who the speaker is. Then I want to spend some time setting the stage. This is just so we can make sure we're speaking the same language. What do I think of a breach and attack simulation program and what I mean by the autonomous portion. After that, I'll go over like the high level components of what makes up an autonomous BAS program, followed by a deep dive on the components that make these up. This will be the meat and bones of the presentation, and there's a lot of content, so bear with me. I'm going to speak a little quickly to make sure I get enough time for the questions and comments, but I'll make sure to go at a good pace. I'll make sure to wrap it up with a summary just so we all know what we should walk away with from this knowledge, and then have a questions and comments section. So just a bit about me. I've had the opportunity to work in the cybersecurity industry for just about 10 years now. I started in the United States Navy at submarine base New London, the first submarine base in the Navy. That was great, but 4 years was enough for me. And after 4 years, I went to an excellent managed detection and response company, doing a lot of blue teaming. I got to monitor many different security controls for many different customers and verticals, which is awesome knowledge for me to gain. And then I got to do some detection engineering as well. So not only monitoring these tools, but also building some detections and filling blind spots for some of these. I then worked for a breach and attack simulation company where I really just helped people operationalize the platform and use it correctly in their environment, as well as help them get a BAS program up and running. I then got to work at a financial institution where I got to do some hands-on red teaming and purple teaming experience. I love doing that. That was an absolute blast. But I also got to do some continuous validation with the BAS tool there as well. That all landed me where I'm at today at Toyota as a breach and attack simulation lead. So on the personal perspective, I'm a simple man. I've been playing guitar for a little over 18 years. I love it as a passion and a hobby. I don't know if you guys can see behind me, but that green guitar right there is fully 3D printed by a buddy of mine. So it plays like a charm and I love it. I love to get with friends, hang out, socialize, and drink beer. And that is my dog, Emmy. She's a golden retriever, but she acts like a hyena at times. But let's hop into it. Setting the stage. I know you all see the title as building an autonomous BAS program. But really quick, I want to go ahead and drop the autonomous part and just talk about what a breach and attack simulation or BAS program is anyway, in my perspective. So in my perspective, there's a few components I look at a BAS program. First off, its main point. It's a way to continuously measure security control performance. So I always give this pitch. Every organization has a ton of moving parts. Obviously, security controls update, softwares on workstations and servers update, security policies change, detection logic changes, people come and go. There's just too many moving parts, in my opinion, to assume that what's prevented and detected yesterday will be the same tomorrow and the day after that. We need some sort of system to continuously stress these security controls so we can get answers every day of like, yes, things are working as expected everywhere. And the moment they're not, we can raise an alarm to the proper parties just so that can get remediated before our next, monthly red team or purple team exercise, or even worse, threat actor finding out for us. Well, I also think that we extend the CTI and red team efforts. What I mean by this is CTI is the brains of the organization. They're looking at who does what, who's attacking us, how they're attacking us, when they are. And they feed that information to red team, which these information feeds turn into engagements that we can make live on, but we can make automated attacks on those attacks that they did, which I call emulations, and run those time after time so they can work on new engagements and operations while we're measuring the effectiveness of what they did throughout time. Which brings me to my third point. It's a system to track progression and regression on our security coverage. So to the point I just made after a red team engagement, No, they may have done 10 attacks, and we know that 3 of those attacks were detected, 1 was prevented at the end of the operation. Well, we have a baseline, and if we were to make emulations on all of those, we should see 3 detections, 1 prevention. But over time, we'd like to see those grow as new detections and policies are changed to start adding more security coverage. On the other end, we can see regression, and right away we can see, oh, we were detecting this here, not anymore. What changed? Maybe a detection engineer modified a detection which had unknown side effects that we can fix right away. So with that being said, well, what's the autonomous part about? Well, as we know, BAS programs are excellent at creating automatic attacks at a click of a button or even scheduled to run. And that part already is autonomous. Moving forward, though, I want to broaden the scope and build a program that is totally hands-off to continuously execute, measure, resolve, and report on emulation and security control performance, and most importantly, without causing stock disruption. So we'll talk a lot about this. I just wanted to go ahead and make sure we're all speaking the same language, what I mean about a BAS program and the autonomous part behind it. So right here at a high level, we have the main components of what make up this autonomous BAS program we're going to talk about. We have the emulation lifecycle. This is going to have a few stages on sourcing, building, testing, and then deploying an emulation. And once it's deployed and running on a schedule, we also have another moving part next to it called the attribution and resolution. This is some sort of system that is continuously making sure that any alerts that relate to our emulations are accounted for and things are resolved right away. This is really important because I want to make sure that we can get information on if our security tools are doing what they should without bothering the SOC. I don't want them to spend time resolving alerts or working alerts on things that we're just testing and giving them a minor heart attack. Come to find out it was just testing activity. I'm here to get answers. Are our tools doing what they should? If so, move on. All that data from the attribution and resolution should be fed into this performance monitoring section, which is something that you can wake up, pour your coffee, and check and see how all your runs did, what was all prevented, what wasn't, what was detected, and what wasn't. And then an optional step here is trend reporting. This is kind of a more grand approach in the performance monitoring and elevates us past just the last run. More so, how did the runs from the last month or 6 months go on various devices and such like that? I call that optional because that's kind of more mature BAS program that people can grow towards. Hopping into the first one, emulation lifecycle. I stated that there's a source, build, test, and deploy for an emulation lifecycle that I like to use. Ironically enough, the source, build, and test sections are actually the only non-autonomous part of this whole lifecycle. That's actually for a reason. Once you build and test an emulation and you deploy it to run on a schedule, that's when it opens the door for everything just kind of working into your performance monitoring and you don't have to touch it anymore. That gives you time and cycles to source, build, and test manually so you can make sure that you're building something that's accurate, safe, and really effective for your environment. But with that being said, we'll start with source. How you source these emulations is very important. I find 3 main categories of where you source an emulation. First off, coming from the cyber threat intelligence team. As I said, they're the brains, they're the ones looking at who's doing what, when they're doing it, how they're doing it, where they're doing it. So them getting emulations to work on is always, a smart move. But my favorite is actually getting them from red and purple team operations. They get their data from CTI as well. So if they can plan, execute, and debrief of an operation, we can see how all those attacks performed and get a baseline, create emulations on those attacks, and measure them over time to hopefully see progression. But if you see regression, you can get on it right away. And lastly, there's the self-source section where, me or my colleagues, we may just see a cool technique that we think is worth emulating. That's all fine and good, but what I recommend is you give a request for information or an RFI to the cyber threat intelligence team, just to make sure the emulation is timely, applicable, and likely. Just to speak on those briefly, timely, what I mean by that is you may have seen a cool technique, maybe it was on Hack the Box or on Bleepy Computer, and it might look cool, but come to find out, threat actors might have not used that since like 2019. And believe it or not, that's 6 years ago. So it might not be relevant or prevalent in the threat landscape. So we want to make sure it's actively being used by threat actors these days if it's worth your time. Moving on from that, applicable, you may see a cool exploit on Linux kernels, and you might want to build an emulation for that. Come to find out your environment is 95% Windows, and maybe the 5% of Linux is a whole different operating system, the juice may not be worth a squeeze on those. And lastly, is it likely? Like I said, cyber threat intelligence is the brains, and they're looking at who's doing what, where, and when. So if you can have techniques and cyber threat intelligence can see that that technique is used by threat actors that target your vertical, maybe that's US-based companies. More specifically, maybe it's targeting automotive manufacturing technology, which relates to my vertical, then obviously that's something that we probably want to emulate. So this is a good way to source your emulations to make sure you're not just wasting time building cool niche things, but more so impactful items to measure in your environment. Once you have maybe 3 emulations sourced, you can go ahead and start building this. So whether it's in a commercial breach and attack simulation platform, a open source, or maybe just your own scripting, whatever you build to make an emulation, it needs these 3 components. It needs to be consistent, safe, and accurate. What I mean by consistent is whenever it's built and you execute it, are you getting predictable results? They might not be desirable results, but is it the same result every time? If it's sporadic, it might not be easy to measure, and you probably want to go back to the drawing board to make sure that this emulation you create is consistent and emulates the right thing every time. Next, and probably the most important, is safety. You want to make sure what you make is obviously not doing harm to your environment. I like to say you want to leave the device the same exact way it was before you ran your emulation. So a good example of this is ransomware. Obviously, you don't want to just download ransomware from the dark web and see how your environment reacts to it. I think everyone here knows that. What you could do is emulate that ransomware by making your own code to do similar encoding techniques, and then go ahead and maybe stage files and directories, maybe even like recursively, and go ahead and encrypt all those, get the response, and then clean up your device. Any file modifications, registry modifications, etc., should be reverted at the end. And then accuracy, you want to make sure what you're testing is actually what you're trying to measure. A good example of this is you may be trying to measure your behavioral analysis of your AV or EDR tool. To do this, a novice engineer might maybe drop Mimikatz to disk and have an interpreter run that Mimikatz in memory to see if it gets blocked. They may see a prevention and they may see a detection and think all is well, but if you look into it, you probably realize that that prevention was really just Mimikatz being quarantined on disk and an interpreter couldn't run it. And that's only testing the static analysis engine. You have no validation that your behavioral analysis is doing what it should. It only tested the static. So instead, you may want to maybe use PowerShell, invoke expression, or .NET assembly, insert into a running program where it never touches disk and you're only measuring behavioral analysis. That's one very specific example, but really you want to make sure whatever component you want to test, are you accurately testing that component? So this is actually a SCYTHE emulation right here. What I'm about to go over really applies to just the core concept of building an emulation. This first highlighted box we have is what I call the setup phase. In steps 1 and 2, it's loading in proper functions that this emulation should have. My emulation is going to run some interpreter, and it's going to download things to stage. Step 3 and 4 is the staging process. Step 3 is actually creating a path where I'm just going to stage all my items that I'm going to place on disk for this test. And step 4 is downloading what appears to be a uuid.csproj to that staging directory. This is just so we can have everything nice and neat in a predictable location on that testing device. And the most important step is step 5. This step, you can see it's running MS-build to run that staged file we just placed. But what makes this step so important is this is the quote-unquote emulation that we're actually measuring. This is, of all the steps here, this is what we want to pull into our system and say, how did this perform, this step? And we can do that by adding tags. This tag right here I have for emulation states, this is an emulation I want to measure, and it's called MS-build code execution. Then we have what justifies this as a success or not. If it was detected and prevented. If it was just detected but not prevented, we're going to count this as a failure. If it was prevented, not detected, same thing. And lastly, the IOC string. This is a string that you're going to use to correlate with any alerts you pulled to see if alerts were generated from your emulation. There's more steps to the correlation that we'll go over later, but this is a key. You can add multiple IOCs to say we want to look for this and this, or this, etc., to make sure you have a proper match. And then the last portion of an emulation is the cleanup stage. Here we can see step 6 is removing the stage directory we had recursively, meaning everything inside it is deleted because we know that was all stage data. And then we're shutting down this emulation. So this is going to kill the parent process of what ran the simulation and any child processes that's currently running under it. So if this were to do registry modifications, file modifications, etc., all of that would be cleaned up here as well. So after you have a consistent, safe, and accurate emulation that's sourced from a valid source from CTI or Red Team data, at this point, you can go ahead and run this. Give it a manual test run. And the top screenshot we have here is the GUI of Microsoft Defender. Again, this applies to any defensive tool here, but you can log into the defensive tool you're trying to measure. And you can see here, here's an alert for us running MS build in that random CS prod file. And you can see there's some threats blocked for this and alerted on. So that's great seeing it visually in the GUI, but we're building something autonomous. We don't want to have to go into the GUI every time, validate something was alerted on, resolve it yourself, etc. So we're going to need a programmatic way to get this data. And to do that, every single tool has some sort of API where you can pull that alert and see it in its programmatic output. In this case, in the bottom screenshot, Microsoft Defender outputs JSON objects for every single alert. This is a very small snippet of the JSON object returned for alerts, but it has some very useful data, like the process ID, the command lines, the date time, the detection status, the device ID, and there's many more key value pairs that are worth evaluating. It just wouldn't fit on this page. So you want to pull those and identify from what the tool generates from a JSON perspective, what can you grab and put into your emulation as an IOC to match and correlate? Make sure that you have just enough so it isn't, if you say, hey, find PowerShell and resolve those, that's obviously way too broad. You want to have things like UUIDs and AND statements to make sure you're really attributing to your detections. So with all that said, after you've sourced, built, and tested your emulation, your next step really is just to schedule it and forget it. I say that with an asterisk because I never encourage anyone to totally forget about what's running on a schedule. Always keep it in the back of your mind, obviously. But at this point, it opens the door for those 3 emulations we talked about and more growing to be deployed and ran on a schedule. Maybe that's once a day at 9 a.m., once a week, whatever cadence you want to see fit. Those are going to continuously run and be measured. So the next component is the attribution and resolution. So this is actually my favorite part, and I think the most important, besides obviously doing the emulations. But now that you have a system running continuously, let's say every day at 9 a.m., you're running 3 emulations to measure, you're then going to have a system that evaluates these emulations consistently and attributes any alerts to detections, emulations, and also resolves those alerts. So no analysts have to work on your things. So I want to say that most breach and attack simulation commercial tools have some sort of solution for this. They're usually pre-made and packaged for all their customers, which will go in and see after you ran the emulations, were there any detections? And also, can you resolve these alerts? They usually provide that, but what I notice is every organization is different, and you may need a more tailored approach to how you pull these alerts, how you're resolving and correlating, etc. So that's why I really like SCYTHE's approach. They actually lean into a workflow automation tool called Workato, which allows you to do a low to no code way of making your own integrations. So you can query as often as you want, how you want to pull this information, how you want to correlate and shape up the data. So you can really have full control over your automated process here. So with that being said, we're going to build something that is running on the side every day at 9 a.m. Your emulations are being kicked off. And also every day, what appears to be every 10 minutes, there's going to be a system running that's looking for emulations, alerts, correlating, and giving you the data. So a lot of people may ask, why every 10 minutes? Why not just wait after the emulation runs? Maybe wait, 5 minutes and then kick off your attribution resolution to see if any alerts are generated. Well, that works 9 out of the 10 times. But from what I've seen is we have a new finding, not just if something is prevented or not, or detected or not, but if something was detected, how long did it take for that detection to actually get into your monitoring pipeline? What I've noticed is custom analytics and custom rules typically rely on logs. And logs are generated on all the servers and endpoints And those logs have forwarders which go to a central location. And then your rules run on a pulse that check those logs and then generate an alert. There's a lot of room for failure and latency here. And I've noticed that sometimes alerts can generate, but maybe after an hour after you ran. And that's something really important to highlight and bring to your leadership on saying, we need to fix this because that's all you know. If you have an alert that happens an hour after the action happened, I mean, the damage is basically done if they were a motivated threat actor. So I run it every 10 minutes, a rolling approach to say continuously check for the BAS simulations, continuously check for new alerts, and every time we see one that correlates, go ahead and resolve it and then bring it back to your system. So let's talk about the steps here. First off, we need to query the BAS. We're going to see some JSON here of whenever we query the BAS, this system is going to make logically a JSON object on the left that we can use to see what all we're trying to measure from an emulation perspective. So this ugly JSON here, what we're seeing is what the system is actually generating on the back end, what I'm saying logically on the left, of querying my BAS solution and saying, what are all the testing points? And it's going to logically separate, we have the device name, workstation 2, and all the events that we're seeing on that workstation. So in my case, when we queried the BAS tool, we saw workstation 2 had 2 emulations tagged with emulation. One called persistence via startup folder, and the other called MS build code execution. That's the one we did for an example. It has really good information about this. It's able to pull the emulation ID, the command that was ran for that emulation, the request timestamp of when that kicked off, the status, the IOCs it will be looking for. Again, you can add multiple. And then the measure prevention detection. This is what justifies if it passed or not. If this is something that is fitting our criteria if we're protected or not protected. Once we have this list, our next step is to form the right logical JSON object. And that's pulling the security control or controls to see any alerts generated in the last 10 minutes. So this is a very watered down JSON object delivered from Microsoft Defender. We see it's going to give you a value array, and it's going to give you JSON objects of every alert pulled in that 10 minutes. This is a very small snippet of what a JSON object would look like, but it gives you stuff like the alert ID that was generated in Defender, the title of that alert, the time that alert was created, the device name, and the command line. And there's many more very, very valuable fields in these alerts that you can use for correlation. But the idea here is every 10 minutes, it's getting your testing points, all your emulations, and then all the alerts pulled from that 10 minutes. And then it's going to go ahead and start doing some sort of correlation. It's going to say, does this emulation relate to any of these alerts? And I want to visualize this in a very, very simple third grade drawing here. On the left, we have all of our emulations that were pulled. You can see that we have the emulation name, the host name, the time it was executed, and the IOC we're looking for in our alerts. On the right, we have all of our alerts pulled in the last 10 minutes. So how I want this system to work is it'll start with the first emulation and look at all your alerts. And it'll say, okay, first emulation and first alert. Does that alert have the same host name? Is it the same testing point? If not, then move on to the next one. It's no need to evaluate that. You know that alert does not relate to this emulation whatsoever, so you can move on to the next one. And we see the next one does have the same host name, but the timestamp is 2 minutes before the timestamp of the emulation. And unless your security control is a fortune teller, there's no way for an alert to generate before an action's actually kicked off. So we know that this one does not relate, so we can move to the next. And we can see the next one does have the same workstation. It's created at the same time and has the same IOC. I want to talk on the timestamp right here really fast, that I like to give maybe a 3 to 5 minute buffer on the timestamp afterwards to say if this happened, at the same time or maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes after, evaluate it. Because that means, it could have taken a while for that alert to actually generate. It won't be immediate every time. And to my point about sometimes things come in an hour later, you should have fields in your alerts that aren't just creation time date whenever the alert was created. There should be like an alert or some sort of first activity time of when those logs were created that generate the alert that took forever to get there. That's a good one to evaluate for the timestamp on those late alerts. But we're going to correlate every single one until we can see that some emulations may have no detection, some may have multiple, and we need to form some sort of master JSON object that your attribution and resolution will use on the back end. You're not going to be looking up these JSONs. This is just what happens on the back end that formats what we're going to see in our monitoring system. So here on the attribute and resolve section, this is a very busy screen, so bear with me. Here's kind of what it looks like. Before, we have all of our alerts generated in Defender. They're all shown new. You can see that we have different devices, DC1, Workstation 2, Workstation 1, and different alert names, etc. Our attribution and resolution system runs every 10 minutes, and after it gets all the emulations and all the alerts and correlates them through what we just discussed, it's going to form this master JSON right here we see on the right, which logically separates the device name and all the events for each device. And says, okay, Workstation 2 seem to have 2 events. We're measuring the persistence via startup folder and suspicious JavaScript download. For persistence via startup folder, you can see it had a detection count of 0. So it didn't match with any alerts. As for the next emulation, it matched with 4 alerts, and we get those alert IDs listed there. And we can see for Workstation 1, same story. So one important thing to know here is after you have this master JSON object, the last thing your attribution and resolution script or process will be doing is it's going to go through every single event, and if it has a detection ID, use that tool's API to resolve. Get that out of the picture so an analyst doesn't work these anymore. And you can get this data back and pump it in your performance monitoring so you can see how this went, and we're going to see that next slide. But you can see at the after section here at the bottom, Microsoft Defender shows that these specific alerts are resolved. 2 on top and 1 at the bottom are not because they relate to a different workstation, DC1. And we can also see that it set security testing as the category of this alert, and it assigned it to some BAS testing account. Now, as an analyst, you'd be able to quickly see, oh, I don't need to work these. These are resolved in security testing of my BAS team. Good. Now they can focus on what matters, the true positives. But again, on the right, this JSON object, we're not looking at this. I wouldn't want to look at this all day. What I'd rather look at is something like this, performance monitoring. This is the Kibana interface from the Elk stack, and I'm lucky enough to have this already embedded in the SCYTHE platform. But if you don't have it embedded in your tool set, you can spin it up with the server. It's free software. And what we have here is a way to pipe that JSON object into Kibana, or actually Elasticsearch to see in Kibana, so you can start visualizing how your last run went. You can quite literally wake up, pour your coffee, log in for the day, and see this dashboard, knowing that all your emulations are running on a schedule. They're being correlated and resolved every day, and all that data is being pumped in here. You can just wake up and look at it. At the top, you have the testing points, where you can choose a specific device, multiple, or all devices. And at the right, you can choose 1, more, or any emulations you want to measure. And at the bottom here, we have the emulation results. On the left, we can see the emulation names. We have SAM Hive dump, Sharpound execution, persistence via startup folder, and JavaScript download. Now we can see 2 of 4 were prevented, and we can see the detections that were found on the right. We can see the persistence via startup folder is the eye-catching one. That not only was it prevented, but it also didn't have a detection associated with it. Surely that's not ideal because we know this emulation was sourced from CTI. It's timely, it's relevant, it's in our threat landscape. So we should have some sort of visibility on it because it could be likely to happen to us. So this is something we can get with a detection team or whoever owns the security controls to show them evidence of we don't see this activity. So we can start building detections and hopefully start to see progressions. Maybe throughout the weeks, as you pour your coffee, check your performance monitoring, you might see this turn green with some detections. That'd be ideal. But instead of looking at just the day-to-day, how each run went, you really could graduate on what I call trend reporting. I put this as optional. And this is dev data here. You're going to see a lot of squigglies, so disregard those. But what we have is all of our emulations that were ran over a time period. And we can see how many were detected, how many were prevented over time. You can start correlating this data to see what you should work on. For example, we have 3 unique devices that ran 43 emulations each. That is 129 individual runs. And of those 129 runs, we detected about 50%, 65 of those. So that means another 50% are not being detected. This gives you the opportunity to drill in and see, Well, why is device A and B detecting emulation X, but device C isn't? Are we forwarding logs from that device? Is it a different security policy? This gives you the ability to kind of see the oddities in your environment and get on it quickly to get more of a consistent secured environment through all your endpoints, especially if a big organization that covers a lot of ground. On the right, we can filter out looking for specific emulations, or even look at like which emulations in the top campaigns, which are like the highest priority ones we should care about. If an emulation is seen in 40 campaigns, but another emulation is found in only one, you might want to prioritize the one seeing a lot of campaigns first. So just a quick summary. I know we covered a lot here. Hopefully I didn't go too fast. I just want to make sure we can wrap everything up and have comments and questions. But I want to cover what the goal is here, just so we all make sure we walk away with the same mindset. We really want to build a fully autonomous BAS program that doesn't just execute automatically, but also measures, resolves, and reports on these emulations and security control performance without causing SOC disruption. We don't want to waste the SOC's time. We want them to spend their valuable time and resource on true positives and unknowns in the environment, while we get all the data of our security tools and how they're performing everywhere on many different devices. So we get the peace of mind that things are either working or know that we need to get on it ASAP. The emulation lifecycle, just a couple takeaways. They should be sourced from a threat-informed defense. Talk to your CTI team or work with your red team that does talk to your CTI team. Make sure that you're not just making things you found on Bleeping Computer or Hack the Box. They should be relevant to your environment. Then build them to make sure they're consistent, safe, and accurate. And once they are, go ahead and give those a test run. See what it looks like in the GUI, and then pull it through the API to see what is your attribution resolution system going to be working with. What do we need to tag these emulations? What can we do to make sure that we can accurately attribute that emulation to any alerts you have generated? And then the easy part, deploy it. Set a schedule and sudo forget about it. Next, we have the attribution resolution section. Again, a lot of breach and attack simulation tools offer a solution for this, and absolutely lean into it if you see fit. I like to say you might want to tailor it to your best approach and get your hands dirty to make something specific so it works to your liking, but absolutely check out whatever solution your BAS product has. But regardless, it should have these capabilities. It should be able to check for emulations executed, check for any alerts in that last run, and then compare every emulation to every alert through a smart way. My way I like to do is the testing point, the time frame, and any IOCs that match. I say testing point because it might not be endpoint. Although this was a big endpoint conversation talking about workstations and servers, you may want to graduate to test network security controls. And a good testing point for that may be, source or destination IPs, things like that. And then you're going to pipe all that information into some sort of performance monitoring. I like the Elk stack. This is because no one wants to read JSON results all day. That will give you a headache. You'd rather read something from a pretty Kibana dashboard. So it should show you prevention and detection statuses of every emulation reported on. It should have the ability to tailor on if you want to look for an endpoint, specific endpoints or specific emulations. And it's really good for seeing how your last run went, on how that run went, or maybe on a specific day. But what's better is seeing the overall data throughout time. What are your trends? What are your progressions and regressions? These are really best used with business intelligence tools. I like Power BI, but if you want more of an open source method, you can go Redash or Metabase. These are great tools that you can spin up alongside your Elk stack to start showing an overtime trend. This is great for just showing over time what devices historically are preventing and detecting, what aren't, why is that the case, what emulations are our biggest concern. And from there, you can really get a big holistic picture of your security coverage in your environment. So I know that was a lot. I wanted to save some time for questions and comments. Happy to answer any on this call if we have time. But if we don't, here's my LinkedIn. Please send me a DM. I'm more than happy to talk about these topics. I obviously love this, so reach out whenever. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jackson. We do have some good questions. Let me key up a couple of these with you. First off, do you run emulations on live assets, or do you have assets set up for BAS use?
Yeah, excellent question. Probably one of the most common one I get. So I am all production. And you guys might think that's wild. That's why I have a very strict source, build, and test pipeline, because I do think testing on VMs is necessary, but also if you're trying to see your security coverage in your environment, those VMs most likely aren't apples to apples with your actual production devices. They're probably in slightly different security policies, different logics being applied to them, and you're not really getting the true answer until you test it in production. That's why I make sure you have a very good pipeline to make sure things are safe and secure before you deploy those.
Excellent. And another one here. What are some of the metrics or executive or tactical should be tracking with BAS? What do you focus on?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So what I like to track primarily is post red team and purple team activities. So they may have done 10 attacks, and we know 3 of those were detected, 1 was prevented. We have the baseline, you can execute those, and then you can make that emulation and the operation live on past that engagement. Give them the freedom to keep working on new things and doing new engagements while you are showing the status of how those 10 attacks are progressing or regressing from your security infrastructure. So maybe 3 months down the road, after that red team engagement's done, you can say, hey, remember when we were detecting 3 and preventing 1? Well, now we're at the point where we're detecting all 10 of them and we're preventing 8 of these. We're really secure at a good risk state. So, kudos to the defensive teams, kudos here and there, we're looking good. That's a big report I like to give. Other than that, just log sources. Things aren't detected because maybe these devices don't have proper logging, things like that.
Excellent. Another one I know that came in through the Discord was how do you add new emulations? How do you determine what you need to add to kind of this series of tests that you're running on a weekly basis?
Yeah, so here's what I don't do. I don't look at the MITRE framework and say, hey, cover this, cover this, cover that. I don't try to boil the ocean. So let me just get that out of the way. I don't do that. What I do like to do is take a quick look at the MITRE perspective and say, what are we currently tapping in on? Maybe there's tactics you're very heavy on, and there's tactics you're very weak. At that point, you can go to the CTI team and say, hey, this is a tactic, maybe it's persistence, that you don't have much coverage on and validation. So can you submit an RFI to say, hey, what threat actors are out there attacking our vertical that we care about, that are using persistence techniques? Those are a good one to emulate, to put into the pipeline of your deployed cycle that are measuring things that are likely to happen to you based on your vertical.
Okay, and then one last one. How do you prioritize your emulations for those focused on MITRE TTP coverage versus performance of your tools?
Yeah, honestly, CTI team helps me. They're my shield. They're the ones that give me reports to say, hey, these are the top attacks to look for. These are the ones that are highly important based on who's likely to attack you. So if you have maybe someone that's a little out of touch, maybe you have a high up CISO that says, hey, cover all these MITRE tactics, you can have some fuel behind you saying, it might not be worth it making our detection team build all these detections and coverage for these niche things that don't apply to our environment. Here are things that do apply to us that we should care about, and maybe talk impact. If this were to happen to you, what's the impact that would happen to your environment? Get them interested. Executives love impact. They don't love the technical stuff like I do. They care about, well, how's that going to affect our money? Well, what's going to happen to us? And we can show that through the CTI data.
Okay, great. And we've got one additional one, which is great presentation, great insights. Have you crossed so many challenges running emulations in a large environment?
Yes, absolutely. It's a growing process every day. I like to look at the breach and attack simulation program as an iterative, continuously improving process. You're not just going to watch this presentation and go ahead and have a flawless breach and attack simulation area in your environment. What we see is our main thing is new detections get deployed and out of the box alerts start being deployed as well. You can't predict what Defender, CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, etc. is going to put out there. So it's possible that when you run these emulations, yesterday everything gets resolved right away. But maybe next week when you run these, new alerts came in, maybe they're custom or they're out of the box, that your IOC attributions don't account for. And this is okay. This is because you can, have your security team reach out saying, hey, we saw these alerts, and you can say, oh, that was my testing. Let me go ahead and add an IOC. And then moving forward, those get resolved in your pipeline. And that's the iterative process. So really, to answer your question, my main challenge is make sure that I'm gathering this information make sure we're secure and validated without bothering the SOC and watering them down with more false positives and testing alerts. So that's a continuous process there.
Awesome. Well, great. I think those are the majority of the questions, Jackson. We definitely appreciate the time. And yeah, if there's other questions, folks, bring them in. We will certainly get them over to Jackson. We'll get them answered for you. And, you can certainly submit them here or the Discord that we've got going. Oh, here's one from Bryson. What's the difference between simulation and emulation, and why should it compare?
Bryson, you got me good. I struggle on this question all the time, just to be completely honest with you. I always speak in emulation terms. I think you saw this. I've worked at a breach impact simulation company where they said it differently and other companies say it differently. I honestly say tomato, tomato. An emulation or simulation is a way to automate an attack and run that alongside manual attacking, like red team and purple team. That might be miles off from your approach, but that's just how I attack that one.
Okay, I'm summoned.
No.
As one of the people who defined this for the industry, I'm going to jump in. So you're right in as much as from a practitioner perspective, it sounds like vocabulary. Who cares, right? And that's what's like, what do you care? But if you actually start breaking down the differences of the kinds of tests you can run, maybe instead of getting hung up on the vocabulary, can you talk through the maturity of the level of realism and scale that some things can do all the way up to the things that you've grown to? Does that make sense? Phrasing it that way?
A bit. So in the same question of simulation versus emulation, you're talking about the maturity is something to look at here?
Well, so to me, a simulation is doing exactly what it is, right? If this was the command, this was the base IOC, that's what I'm running. Emulations now allow me the flexibility of focusing on behavior, right?
Okay.
One of the other things going back to your presentation, you talked about chasing MITRE attack. Chasing MITRE attack to me is a simulation approach, right? I ran this procedure from MITRE attack, and then I ran this procedure from MITRE attack. And the way I always describe MITRE attack is thinking of it like a periodic table. Because if I test hydrogen and I test oxygen, if I do these individual simulations, I'm missing the state change of a chemical equation, which is actually what an attack is. So if things aren't informing each other, that's also the difference between a simulation and an emulation.
Interesting. Yeah. Speaking of MITRE, how I view it is like, a MITRE technique is a broad way to do something. Maybe it's, persistence via registry, run once key. That is in my opinion, an emulation is a way to do that anyway, but there's maybe 20 different ways to do that same technique. And maybe those are the simulations to the overall emulation, shot in the dark. But I'll take some notes on that. Thank you, Bryson.
Well, excellent, everybody. We are now on a break for 20 minutes. We are going to basically give everyone time to grab some lunch.
Mark, would this be a good time to run a raffle?
It would be a great time to run a raffle.
And also, I just want to say, Jackson, I've been seeing what you've been doing at Toyota, and it has blown me away. I mean, I'm not saying this to like fluff you or anything. Seriously, what you've been doing, and I hope folks at home realize the level of the presentation you just got. This is one of the reasons that this vertical, this space, and so many of us have been struggling is figuring out how to automate these elements in a meaningful way, right? If you just automate stuff, that doesn't make it better, right? That's one of the challenges SOAR has, is how do I automate things that drive value that I can measure? And what Jackson showed and what Jackson has built, and again, I think, Jackson, you're uniquely qualified because you've done so many different of these pieces that you finally were able to pull it together the way you have. I mean, again, just kudos. For me personally to you, it's amazing.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. It's been a fun ride so far using the platform.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jackson.